when it comes to the conflict in Gaza, we have Jews, Muslims, and Christians all involved in this conflict. How do you see the responsibility of the Biden administration in dealing with this issue? Because Biden always bragging about being a Christian. He's a good Christian. I'm going to take care of people of faith.
This is a sad subject, Nima. You say that Biden prides himself on being what is called in this country a practicing Catholic. Well, I just wish he'd practice more, you know. I just wish he'd learn more about what it means to be a Christian, not just a Catholic, and actually to be a Jew and to be a Muslim, because we all come out of this same Abrahamic tradition. And what not many people realize, and which I learned only belatedly, that's one good thing about getting old, you get lots of experience, okay? What I learned is that Yahweh of the Hebrew scriptures and Jesus of Nazareth and the prophet, they share a belief, a strong belief, that the most important thing is that we do justice, okay? It's a common strain going through all these traditions, the Abrahamic tradition. Now, when I was in college, people said, "Well, you know, what's ethics? Or what do you mean by justice?" And we were taught, "Oh, that's simple. You do good and you avoid evil." Okay, sounds sensible. And I learned they only got that half right. You don't avoid evil, you confront it. Okay, I had to learn that from rabbis, from Protestant priests and Protestant ministers, a couple of Catholics who espouse liberation theology. And, you know, it really goes back to actually the first word for justice in the sacred scriptures, pre-Aramaic, like, you know, the language that Jesus spoke, pre-Aramaic, the word for justice was showing mercy to the poor. I mean, like that was the definition, like it's not the connotation or anything like that. Justice, tzidkah, meant showing mercy to the poor. Okay, wow. So gradually I learned that, well, you know, if, as Rabbi Heschel said, he said when, and Rabbi Heschel died just recently, over the last couple of years, he said, you know, when injustice happens, we're not all guilty, but we all are responsible. Ignorance or forgetting about injustice is worse than injustice itself. Now, took a lot of sort of metanoia, a little turning around my mind here to figure out, well, you know, if you're going to be a follower of not only Jesus of Nazareth, which I try to do, but Yahweh and the prophet, who is good on these things, then that means doing mercy to the poor, showing mercy to the poor. Now, okay, that's a long-winded way of saying, what are we doing in Gaza? For the first time in my life, for the first time in the life of America, our president is participating, enabling, arming those who are doing genocide in Gaza. There's no two ways about it. Now, I was old enough to live throughout World War II. I was born 1 week before it started, all right? I don't remember much about the war except waiting for a quarter of a pound of butter at 5 years old. But I do remember what happened, and that was genocide, all right? Now, does it have to be 6 million? No. After the war, the international law was codified to make it very clear it doesn't have to be the whole ethnic group. It can be part of it, but the intent and the actions were equally important. Now, one good thing is that there has been a UN referral to the International Court of Justice, and that could result in restraining Israel and the United States. But my concern is it's going to take too long. So when I saw that a Lutheran priest in Bethlehem, like Bethlehem, right, where Jesus is supposed to have been born, he made a really gutsy speech, and he called out religious leaders as well as secular leaders. His name is Reverend Munter Isaac. He called out what he termed the Church of Empire, as well as the Western leaders' hypocrisy about human rights, as if they don't apply to the Palestinians. Religious denominations, he said, take refuge in the meaningless platitudes and empty words of empathy. I say again, empty words of empathy. Wow, empty empathy. There you go. He said, God stands always on the side of the oppressed, unequivocally on the side of the oppressed. Now, that reminded me of all these learnings that I learned earlier on. And, it's such a tragedy that the Jews themselves, having suffered Holocaust, would be calling, as one senior secular leader did just a couple of weeks ago, for Shoah, Holocaust, using the same word, Holocaust, against the Palestinians. And Western leaders, and what pains me most, Western churches, the ones that call Biden a practicing Catholic, can't find their voices. Now, I don't want to sound preachy about this, but I was asked 4 years ago, hey, on your Twitter feed, you have "you're a justice person." What does that mean? And so I said, oh, okay, I'll write about that. And I did exactly 4 years ago. It appeared in Consortium News on the 1st of January, 2020. Now, in that, I treat a little bit what I know about post-World War II. Now, I was young, right? So I didn't learn this at the time, but I learned later that in critiquing the church's position in World War II, the Dominican monastery in La Tour Marbourg, France, invited Albert Camus to come and talk to them about how he saw the conduct, the behavior of the church writ large during World War II, during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. Okay. Now, they knew Camus was an atheist, but they also knew that he spoke the truth. And so I give it over to them. I applaud them for inviting him. I'm going to just read just a little bit of what Camus said, because it relates so much to what's going on now and to the continuing silence of the church. Here's Camus. It's 1948, so 3 years after the war. For a long time during those frightful years, I waited for a great voice to speak up in Rome. I, an unbeliever? Precisely, for I knew that the spirit would be lost if there were no cry of condemnation. It has been explained to me since that condemnation was indeed voiced, but it was in the style of encyclicals. And so I, Camus, asked, what is an encyclical? The condemnation was voiced and it was not understood. Whose fault is that? What the world expects of Christians is that Christians should speak out loud and clear, and they should voice their condemnation in such a way that never a doubt, never the slightest doubt, could rise in the heart of a simplest man, that they should get away from abstraction, and confront the blood-stained face that history has taken on today. We need men resolved to speak out clearly and to pay up personally. Lastly, what I know This is Camus finishing up. What I know and what sometimes creates a deep longing in me is that if Christians made up their mind to it, millions of voices, I say millions, would be added to a handful of isolated individuals who today intercede almost everywhere and ceaselessly for children, so that no more children would be killed, as Roger Waters would say. So I just leave it at there. It's just really very painful that people stick to their monasteries and their seminaries and their universities and pretend that a person like Joe Biden is acting in a justice, much less a Abrahamic way. And this needs to be said. Maybe I'd add one more thing. Back in the day, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was head of a ecumenical church school. It was called the Servant Leadership School in Washington. And here's a very poignant little anecdote. I invited Bishop Gumbleton, a very progressive Catholic bishop from Detroit, who used to go to Iraq regularly and go to Syria and other places in the Middle East where the United States was committing so many atrocities by, for example, depriving young children of the necessary means to live. You'll recall Madeleine Albright, the previous Secretary of State, saying when she was asked, Leslie Stahl, the CBS reporter, but Secretary Albright, 500,000 children below the age of 5 dead because of those sanctions on Iraq? Do you think that's worth it? No, Bart said, yes, it's worth it. We think it's worth it. So anyhow, here is Gumbleton just back from a trip from Iraq and having persuaded the rest of the American Catholic bishops to condemn those sanctions as unconscionable. Wow. Now, these were good bishops appointed by John the 23rd, okay? Unconscionable. So I asked Gumbleton to come and speak to this ecumenical group, and he did. And he talked about holding a child who he knew would be dead next time he went to Iraq and so forth. And one of the Protestant women raised her hand and said, "Now, Bishop Gumbleton, that was a really courageous statement you made, all your bishops made about how unconscionable it was to keep these sanctions in place. What kind of reaction did you get from the administration?" And I said to myself, oh no, Gumbleton's a straight shooter, and he's going to say something very embarrassing. And sure enough, he did. He said, well, ma'am, the administration looks on us as 225 possible votes. Now, if we went back to our dioceses and told all our pastors to preach this from the pulpit, then there are 65 million Catholics. Then they would take us seriously. But we don't. And the pastors don't. And everybody keeps their mouths shut. And I looked on at Tom Gumbleton, who was a good friend of mine. I looked at all the other people, 300 of them in this little hall, big hall. And it was like, oh, damn, this is the right word. Oh, damn. Where is the moral authority here? It's certainly not in the Catholic hierarchy now, today. And I had another experience. Maybe this is the last. I'll finish up with this. I was talking to a group of Presbyterians in Dallas, right after Bush stopped being president. And they were all thinking, oh, our neighbor Bush is so great because he saved us from more terrorism after 9/11. And, I couldn't understand this, especially since torture had come out then, all right? So I knew, because I keep up with these things, that the stated clerk that's the name for the interim chief of the Presbyterians, had made a really courageous statement saying torture is always wrong, always reprehensible, always wrong. And so I turned to the pastor, and as I was speaking, I said, now, Pastor, you certainly have shared that very gutsy, very courageous statement with your faithful here. And the pastor looked like the proverbial deer in the headlights and said, I'm not familiar with that statement, Mr. McGovern. And I said, well, now, isn't he sort of interim head of your, well, yes, but I could you give me the link? I looked at those people. I said, oh my God, here I was going to applaud them for this gutsy statement, and nobody knew about it. So it's nice to have encyclicals, like Camus said, nice to have empathetic type statements, but without work, without real activity, nothing's going to happen. And I'll just close with that, because one of my heroes is Cesar Chavez. And he used to always say, look, I got an idea. Let's do a grape boycott. That will get their attention, And everyone below him would say, Cesar, we can't do that. He said, why not? There aren't enough of us. And Cesar used to always say, there are enough of us, but without action, nothing's going to happen. And that's what we face right now. Without action, without speaking out and putting our bodies on the line, this support for genocide, not only in the United States, but also to a degree in Europe, it's going to continue until either most of those 2.3 million Palestinians are killed or driven into the desert in the Sinai. So enough of my preaching here. I just feel so torn by being the kind of believer that Camus was calling for back in 1948. I'm afraid I've become educated that it's not enough to do good and avoid evil. You have to confront it. That's the end of my little homily on my sermon for today. Now we can get to more practical matters if you wish. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say these things.
My pleasure, Ray. When it comes to the conflicts in the world, we see that China and Russia together try to bring Iran and Saudi Arabia together. And Russia is trying to help Azerbaijan and Armenia to talk to each other, to put their differences aside, to work on a common ground. When it comes to the US, there was a huge opportunity for the Biden administration in the case of Ukraine to negotiate with Russians right now in Gaza, to force the Netanyahu administration to find a political settlement in Gaza. But they're not doing this. They're not helping these people.
The answer is embarrassingly simple. President Biden styles himself as a self-admitted Zionist. Not a Jew, but a Zionist. There's a big difference, There's a political movement, and Zionists is a racist ideology which says that Jews are superior to other races. It's pure and simple, okay? That's that. Then there is the influence of the Israel lobby, not only on people like Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland, others, but also on the US Congress. There is so much money come from wealthy Jewish people in our country that they can determine whether someone is able to run for election in the primaries, for example, primary concept. They're down to that now. And they can determine whether a senator or a representative has enough money to get reelected. Okay, that's very potent. And the other thing is what I call the military-industrial, well, I was going to say military-industrial complex, but it's far more than that. We may have discussed this before, but maybe it's worth repeating what Eisenhower said is our major threat to our democracy was the growth, whether intentional or not intentional, of what he called the military-industrial complex. He was going to say military-industrial congressional complex, and that's in his speech, and it's crossed out. Now, was this true then as it is now? Why was it crossed out? Oh, yes, Susan Eisenhower, his granddaughter, and she said, well, I crossed that out himself because he needed just a little bit more cooperation from Congress. So politics reigned supreme. But what I've coined is a new acronym, and it more appropriately describes how the MIC, the military industrial complex, has grown. I call it a Mickey Mat. If you got a pencil, your listeners, you might want to take this down, right? It's on the final exam. Okay, got that? Okay. It's the military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. Now, if you think of all those institutions, they're all in on the act. When I say media, that's because media is the linchpin. Without the media, these other guys couldn't do all that they do. And who controls the media? The rest of the Mickey Man. You see it infiltrating academia. You see it in all manifestations. And it's become, well, I just learned that 20% of US production is for arms. 20% of the whole US production of, is for armaments. And so that works into this because there are people, they're only 1%, but they're really powerful, right? And they control the wealth more than the next 95%. And they have this incredible influence on Congress. So they are profiteering on these wars. They are likely to try to keep them going. And if things peter out as they had 10 years ago in Europe, well, then pivot to the east, challenge China. Why challenge China? Because, as Joe Biden said 2 months after he was inaugurated, China aspires to be the most powerful country in the world, not only economically, but politically and militarily. That's not going to happen on my watch. I thought to myself, oh no, why not? Yeah. What are there, 1,400,000,000 people there? Why not? Do they threaten us? And the answer, of course, is, in my view, they do not threaten us unless we threaten them. And they have a way, the Chinese do, of saying, why can't we just get along? I mean, we have not only 3 centuries, we have kind of 3, what do you call them, millennia behind us. We've learned to kind of get along with people. We haven't been in a war since forever. Like maybe we had a dust up with the Vietnamese, but that didn't amount to much. We don't care about you guys. We just want to develop our own thing. Well, how about a live and let live? How about a win-win policy? Wow. What about a win-win policy? No way. Why? Because of the Mickey Mat, the military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. The think tanks and academia just suck up a lot of money from the federal government. So don't leave them off. It's the Mickey Mat supreme. So that's why I think that we continue to be in these wars. And unless we have some benign, unless we have more educated and less fearful. I mean, Biden, I think Biden's really afraid. I don't think he needs to be afraid, but his acolytes won't think to tell him, Mr. Biden, Russia is not going to go, and it's not going to go into Poland or the Baltics. I mean, it's not even go very far into Ukraine. Russia just wants this. They're afraid to tell them that because, just like the Chicoms in East Asia, you got the Russians going to take over the rest of Europe. It's crazy, and it could get us in a pile of trouble.
Antony Blinken just recently said that we have invested in Ukraine's democracy, in Ukraine's future, in its freedom. With what has happened to Ukraine so far, does it have anything to do with democracy, with freedom? Do you see any bright future for Ukraine?
Nima, Ukraine is a basket case. It all has to do with the real reasons why the U.S. is in Ukraine. And that was revealed by this not particularly bright fellow named Lloyd Austin when he was Secretary of Defense. And he talked about one of our aims is to weaken Russia. I quote, "We are going to move heaven and earth to make sure that Ukraine weakens and defeats Russia, period," end quote. Now, okay, that's sort of an expression. We're going to move heaven and earth, okay? But, it betrays an attitude that reflects a feeling that we can move heaven and earth. And you have Joe Biden himself talking to one of those interviewers, and the interviewer says, "Well, can you handle a two-front like with China and Russia?" And Joe Biden says, "Look, we're the United States of America, the most powerful country ever. Did you hear me? The most powerful country in the history of the world. In the history of the world. Come on." Well, I'm afraid he believes that. I'm afraid that Blinken and Sullivan, a little younger and a little brighter, are too afraid to tell him, "Joe, that's not the case anymore, okay? And we can't work our will against China and Russia." In my view, it's an ideological thing left over from the Red Scares of the 50s and 60s, but it's very mischievous, okay? It's going to get us in a lot of trouble because I think Biden actually believes that, and he thinks that the fate of the free world lies in his hands. And worse still, he thinks that Bibi Netanyahu is somebody that's worth supporting for as long as it takes. Whoa, that's what he used to say about Ukraine. Now he says about Ukraine, for as long as we can. Difference, okay? How long will it be? How many more thousands of Palestinians will have to be killed in Gaza before Joe Biden says, "Well, we're going to support that rightist government in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for as long as we can." And it's up to us to put that end date on this, to tell the president, "You can do this no longer." And I dare say there are enough people that are upset about this, just as I am, that we can go ahead and make a difference here. Now, what I fear, and this is a legitimate fear in my view, this is the first time that one nuclear-armed superpower has challenged another nuclear-armed superpower, and this Russia superpower considers Ukraine a core interest, a key danger to its national security. Now, up till now, superpowers just, didn't challenge each other so frontally or with weapons. So what's different now? Well, I go back to President Kennedy, who was responsible for my coming down to Washington and so many of my colleagues. And what he said was, look, the last thing we should do is put a nuclear armed power before a choice between humiliation and defeat and acquiescing. Okay. Now, contrary to what Biden has said, it's not the Russians that have lost, it's the Ukrainians and the US. Now, it's not quite apparent to Americans yet, but it will have to become clear in the next couple of months because the Russians are on the move and the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, money, everything else. Okay. So what am I saying? Well, Biden and his acolytes are looking at this and say, oh my God, we tried to move heaven and earth. Heaven and earth isn't listening to us anymore. And maybe we're not all powerful. Maybe we're not, the United States of America anymore. Okay. So what do? Oh my God, there's an election. Now, those of you who know American politics know that in an election year, everything depends on the election. Okay. More so this time. Why? Because Joe Biden, if he loses the election, he'll go to jail. I'm not talking Hunter Biden. I'm talking Joe Biden. They've got the goods on him. I know enough about what the court documents say and what the various congressional hearings have said to know that if that very, very dangerous guy comes in instead of Joe Biden, he's going to be very vengeful. And it could be that Joe Biden, even in his dotage, will end up in jail. Not only him, but Hunter. Not only Hunter and him, but Jake Sullivan, who concocted Russiagate, and Tony Blinken, who concocted the fairy tale that Hunter's laptop was a Russian intelligence disinformation operation just a week or two before the election. And, well, anyhow. So these guys have a personal interest in not losing the war, because losing the war means they're losing the election and they might lose their freedom. Now, I do not exaggerate. That's how they have to look at this, in my view. And, in my view, you have to look at how Putin and his acolytes look at this. Putin has said in the past, U.S. foreign policy is a creature of domestic considerations. We ought to recognize that, be on the watch for that. Now, in an election year, that goes in spades. So what am I saying? I'm saying that Putin has to be very, very careful here because, let's say the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this Air Force 4-star, that Defense Secretary Austin come to Joe Biden, like they did several months ago, and say, the Ukrainians want more 155 millimeter shells for the howitzers and for their artillery. And Biden would say, well, let's give them some bars. And so, oh, sir, we don't have any. You don't have, we have enough, but we can't give any more away. Oh, well, tell the Europeans to give them. Oh, they don't have any either. Well, what else we got? Well, we got these cluster munitions. Many countries ban them, so we gave them. Now, what happens when we run out of cluster ammunition? Okay. I ask you, what happens? Now, these guys are crazy enough to say, well, up on that top shelf there with the lock, we have the combination, Mr. President. Those are the mini nukes, okay? And we could use a little mini nuke. And they're just small, maybe 1/10 the size of those bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, yeah, that'll show the Russians that they won't win this war in Ukraine. Now, would that happen? I wish I could say, no, it would never happen. But these guys are crazy. Putin has called them crazy. I'll just refresh your memory. 14 months ago at one of these long Q&As, he was asked, how do you judge the fact that the U.S. is taking on China as well as us in Ukraine? And what he says was, and I've memorized this, Putin. At first I thought there was some clever plot here, but I no longer think so. I think they're just crazy, I think one must attribute it to arrogance and a feeling of impunity, period, end quote. So, all right, why am I saying all this? I'm saying that I think Putin has to take that into account, the more so because he's got his generals behind him saying, look, Mr. President, we don't care whether Sullivan and Blinken uh, intend to use a mini nuke. We know they have it. We look at capabilities, not intentions. So we have to be on high alert lest something like this happen before the election. That's big. And, when I hear myself saying this, I say, my God, is this the first time you've been so afraid, McGovern? And I have to answer, yeah, it is. And how many decades have you been at this? About 5. So never before has one nuclear power threatened another with a humiliating defeat or the use of these things. Russia, I think, is clever enough, Putin especially, to just gradually attrition, right? Attrit, not giving Biden any excuse to get involved with boots on the ground. But it worries me sick that Biden would get up just 10 days ago, as he did, and say, American forces might be facing Russian forces in Ukraine before long. Why is that? If Russia attacks one of our NATO countries. Oh, okay. So if. Now, just yesterday, there was a Russian shell that apparently flew over part of Poland. Poland protested, of course. What's to prevent some hothead in Ukraine or Poland or somewhere else from a false flag attack on a NATO country? What's to prevent that? That's happened before. Really weird things have happened before, like blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. The capability is there. So that would be the sine qua non for NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine, a attack on one of these NATO countries. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen, but if I were Putin, I would say, oh, well, this is a little signal here, okay? This is a little signal that maybe they do want to introduce NATO boots on the ground to stem this defeat. It's not going to work, but experience has shown that they don't realize these things aren't going to work. I mean, they should have listened to President Obama, who said Russia has escalatory dominance around Ukraine. Well, fancy word, right? You know what that means, being able to escalate in a dominant way, Now, Obama also said, and people forget this, is the worst thing we could do is give offensive weaponry to Ukraine. You know why? Because then we might mislead them into thinking that they could defeat a much superior country like Russia. Oh, Biden was vice president now. I don't know what he's doing when Obama reasoned to these very cogent conclusions, but he's done just the opposite. So it's a very delicate balance we have here. And my point is that the US doesn't really have any other options than these crazy mini nukes or a humiliating defeat in an election year. And if I were Putin, I'm not, of course, but my whole career was to put myself in the shoes of Russian Soviet leaders, okay? And I would have to be looking at this situation. It's very, very dangerous. The more so since the people who are vying to be nominees of various parties, most of them are as crazy as Putin, I'm sorry, as crazy as Biden in pretending that the US has to remain not only the exceptional country in the world, but the indispensable country in the world. And that went out with decades ago. And the problem is these people are so, they have such a feeling of arrogance and impunity, to quote Putin again, that they don't seem to realize that they certainly don't behave as though they understand it.
Germany have sent soldiers to Lithuania at the border with Russia. Spain has sent troops to Slovakia at the border with Russia. Do you see these type of movements as an escalation on the part of NATO?
It only makes sense in a public posturing sort of mode. The Germans, the rest of NATO, are very clearly not up to a war with Russia. The German defense minister said, Russia is a threat after if we let them win in Ukraine, they're going to go all the way farther west, okay? So we're about 5 to 8 years behind them. We've got to build up our defense industries, our own Mickey Mat, if you will, to catch up. And in 5 to 8 years, we'll be able to catch up. So think about that. If the Russians were a threat, they're being told, look, now's the time to strike, because these guys are going to be ready to handle you for 5 to 8 years. And you have the head of the Netherlands just today saying, oh, we got to be prepared for a war with Russia. There is absolutely no sign, no indication that Russia wants anything more than to make sure that Ukraine is neutral, that it doesn't have offensive strike missiles in it, and that there's a sanitary cord there that would prevent the West from shelling people in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk, and that situation can return to the situation before we started a coup in Kiev and completed the coup in Kiev on 22 January 2014, which was announced on YouTube on the 4th of March 2014. So it was really and truly the most blatant coup in the history of mankind, having been announced by virtue of the leak of an intercepted conversation between Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, and the U.S. Ambassador in Kiev. I mean, it's there. It's a conversation saying who's going to be the next prime minister and who's going to come in to seal the deal. A fellow named Joe Biden, who was the vice president at the time, he'll come in. He's all set. How do we know that? Because his national security advisor, a guy named Jake Sullivan, he told Hillary Clinton, yeah, this is going to just work out just fine. So, I mean, there it is. It's all laid out. Do Americans know that? Well, not unless they listen to your program, Nima, and programs like it. And that's why I'm so delighted to be able to talk to you today.
There were Russian studies, Soviet Union studies in those days that were helping the policy of the United States toward Russia. We are experiencing the same issue with Arab states right now in the Middle East. How do you see this case for the US foreign policy? Are they going to getting better? Are they going to getting worse?
It's hard to think, Nima, how they could get much better. Remember the academia think tank last part of the Mickey Mat. At the end of the Soviet Union, when people were not expecting Russia to implode, and people like Bill Casey, head of the CIA, and Robert Gates, his deputy for analysis, was saying, the Russians are really bad. They will never give up power. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union will never, ever give up power without a major revolution or violence. Well, they were wrong. Did they suffer from that? No. What happened? We took advantage. It's very easy to say. We took advantage of the fall of the Soviet Union. And we sent people from the Department of Treasury and Commerce, and we've sent the Harvard boys, the fellows who knew how to privatize things, how to work with the oligarchs in Russia. the oligarchs in Ukraine, the oligarchs on Wall Street, and privatize and take over what was left of the Russian economy. It was so bad, Nima, that according to World Bank figures, between 1991 and 1995, Yeltsin years, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, the average age of a male, the mortality rate or whatever you'd call it, when a male Russian would die, went from 61 to 57. No, I'm sorry, 63 to 57. 6 years. 6 years and 4 years. People dying on the street. The Harvard boys exploited that. They plundered the Russian economy, and Putin was around to watch all this. Not only that, but they started expanding NATO. Bill Clinton putting his arm around the drunken Yeltsin and saying, don't worry about it, we'll just be fine, So by some act of providence, in my view, Yeltsin looks around, maybe feels a pang of conscience as to what he's done to Russia. And he says, all right, maybe this guy can fix it. Putin, you're the man. And that was what, New Year's Eve, 1999. So what happened? Well, Putin started to say, well, this is great. George H.W. Bush used to talk about a Europe free and whole from Lisbon to Vladivostok. So why don't we join NATO? Well, what would you think of that? Well, these same oligarchs, these same Mickey Mouse people, hey, we need you to be an enemy, man. We can't build common European battle tanks and all this other stuff without an enemy. So sorry, no NATO. And the rest of the story unfolded. So consonant with that, or concurrent with that, was the Russian studies departments of all these universities, okay? Who gave money? The Mickey Mouse. What kind of ideology did they preach? The Russians are bad, the Russians are bad, the Russians will do this and that. So now with respect to Arabic studies, which is really a question, back in the day, when I was first coming on in government, 60s, 70s, there was a high degree of expertise at the State Department and at the CIA with respect to Arab as well as Israel policies. Matter of fact, when I came on in 1963 or so, I looked at the Arab-Israeli branch in the Office of Current Intelligence, the analysis group, and I didn't see any Jewish people there. And it struck me as odd, so I asked the branch chief, why are there no people of Jewish extraction here? And he said, well, this sounds un-American, but, people of Jewish extraction might have a little more difficulty being objective, being unbiased. And so we don't have any Arabs here either. So we're just trying to be extra cautious about bias and prejudice. Okay, well, that was the 60s. When I left 1990, there were no Arabs still, but there were lots of people of Jewish extraction. And I know it's gotten even more pronounced since I left. So you have that, and then you have people who are funding people that are in these Israeli or Middle East think tanks that are, George Soros or a lot of these other people that have a pretty biased view on all this kind of stuff. So there are no real Arabists left in the State Department that I know of. And I've been away from the CIA for a while, but there were very few when I left. They had one, let's see, what was his extraction? I think he was Turkic, who was working in the Arab-Israeli branch. That's as close as they came to a Palestinian. So what I'm saying here is that the bias and the prejudice, that distorts justice, okay, is very rampant in these institutions. And it's really hard to get a straight answer. Now, let me just go back a little bit to what we were talking a little bit earlier. The ideal, of course, the American ideal is this justice lady with a blindfold on so she can't see either of the scales, right? So she's completely unbiased and unprejudiced. Now that's the ideal. That's the American concept of justice. Going back to what we started talking about, the biblical concept of justice is biased and prejudiced to the core in favor of the anuim, the old Aramaic word for the poor, the hated poor, the despised poor, the widow, the orphan, the refugee, the Gazan, the people in Gaza right now. So when we talk about unbiased, well, we can aspire to an unbiased view in our intelligence and our diplomatic work. It's really hard to come by, but the ideal is still set before Americans, no bias. Well, that's unbiblical. The biblical solution here is showing mercy to the poor, the denotation of the original word for justice in pre-Aramaic. Now, I just say one thing for myself. Now, when I learned all this, I took a certificate degree in theology at Georgetown University. There were lots of Jesuits there back from Central America. They taught me about liberation, la teología de liberación, okay? Liberation theology. And one of them actually went back to replace one of those 6 Jesuits that were killed, assassinated. His name was Dean Brackley. And he was not only a community organizer in the Bronx, where I grew up, he was also professor of theology with a doctorate from the University of Chicago. Okay, so he's a really smart guy. And he reduced it all for me. And he said, this is what Jesus preached, okay? He said, this is, and I've adopted this as sort of my thumbnail theology. Ready? It all depends on who you think God is and how God feels when little people are pushed around, and how God feels when little people are pushed around. That's the sum and substance of it. That's why I feel so aggrieved and so angry at the enabling role that my government is playing when 2.3 million Palestinians are pushed around. Sorry, I keep coming back to that, but that's first and foremost in my mind today.